to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story.
Right, so that's what's going on. They're grumbling and complaining and saying, God's brought us out here to starve to death. And so it says, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. And by the way, what's the word bread mean in that context? Food. It doesn't literally mean that loaves of bread are going to fall out of the sky. He's saying, I'm going to provide food like rain, like I provide the rain. I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I might test them, whether or not they will walk in my instruction. And it will come about on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and I'll get it out in a minute. So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, at evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us? And Moses said, this will happen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and bread to the full in the morning, for the Lord hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord. So ultimately what Moses is saying is God has something in store. God's going to provide bread and meat. And some of that's looking forward to something that'll occur. Anybody have any idea what the meat in the evening? The quail. That's kind of looking forward to some things that are going to happen. And the big point that's being made here is, hey, you're not really complaining about me and Aaron. When you complain, your complaint is against God. And that's a big and an important thing for the people to come to realize, is that their grumbling is not really against the people that they think they're grumbling against.
Samuel in the 8th chapter, 1 Samuel, their desire for monarchy is not a rejection of you, it's a rejection of me.
Right. And I mean, there's a lot of things. In a more modern twist on this, how might we look at it? Do we ever grumble about the governing authorities? Who raises the governing authorities? So we need to be careful about that, don't we? And realize that we may just be grumbling against God. Now, does that mean that the governing authorities are always good? Was Nebuchadnezzar a good guy? Was Nero a good guy? And yet God raised them to their positions. We know with respect to Nebuchadnezzar specifically that God raised him up to his position, and for a specific reason. And so to grumble against Nebuchadnezzar would be to grumble against God's provision, even though it wasn't a pleasant one. Because what was Nebuchadnezzar's duty when he was raised up as king? What God used him for? To discipline the Israelites. Now, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful, but its end is what? Its end is the fruit of righteousness. It's a good thing in the end. And so while the experience with Nebuchadnezzar may not have been positive, if they learned from it, It was good for them. So it's kind of like grumbling about your parents when your parents tell you can't do something. Kids never do that, do they? We've never complained that our mom and dad didn't let us go do something that we wanted to do, even though it may have been in our best interest. We've never complained because they grounded us or we got a spanking. Most of us are old enough that we lived through the age where you did actually get spankings. We never complained about that, did we? True story, kid got drug out of the assembly one time yelling, "Don't beat me, mama." Never complain about something like that, but that discipline is done why? Out of love and with the intent of good. At least that's the way it ought to be. If it's discipline, that's the way it's done. So it's kind of the same thing when you complain against those that got it. Where did Moses come from, by the way? He was chosen by God. He was called by God. What had Moses done? He had gone in there and advocated for them with Pharaoh and led them out with the help of God. And so to grumble against Moses is to grumble against God because Moses was walking with God. As we go on and consider this, what else might we conclude from these opening remarks? He introduces this idea that you're going to get the day's portion, right? Where does that idea creep up again? Give us this day our daily bread. And what was it? Is it Deuteronomy 8? Where he says, man shall not live by bread alone. Why did he have it so that they just got a day's portion? How many of you just get a day's portion of food every day? You don't have a freezer, you don't have a refrigerator, you don't have a pantry full of food. You just have a day's portion. Yeah, I didn't think so. Do you know how hard it is to have the kind of trust to say, okay, he said a day's portion and then stop? Yeah. And some of them failed to test. And there's some consequences for that. And then he says, oh, by the way, there's going to be this seventh day that comes around. I'm only going to provide this for 6 days. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring it in, it will be twice as much. And as you read further, or as we read further, we're going to learn that there were some on that day that did not do what he told them to do. And then on the seventh day, when it wasn't supplied, they were what? They were hungry. And so, why does God give instructions like this? Why did he set it up that way? Why did he provide the manna for 6 days and not provide it on a seventh day? Okay, so this is a test of faith that's going on. Is the word Sabbath in here anywhere? If it's not, it will be in a moment. I don't remember if I've read it yet. I don't think I have. Understand, when was our conception of the Sabbath introduced? Part of the law. Has the law been given yet? Now, that doesn't happen until when? Chapter 20. They're not to the mountain yet. But the idea of the Sabbath has, in fact, already been introduced way back at the very beginning of the story in Genesis. Chapter 1, where God rested from all his labor. And that's what the word Sabbath means. is rest. And the implication from what we're going to be reading here and what we read in Exodus 20 is that they already had a concept of Sabbath in their mind. And this wasn't exactly creating the Sabbath as much as he's giving meaning to the Sabbath. And this is a test of faith. Will we do what God has asked us to do? Will we limit what we gather? Will we work harder, gather more at the appropriate time? Again, remember, he said, gather no more than what you can eat in the day. And then he says, but on the sixth day, gather twice as much. Are we going to listen to God and limit ourselves when we're supposed to limit ourselves and extend ourselves when we're supposed to extend ourselves? For instance, let's again modernize this for our circumstances. What kinds of things has he told us that we should limit ourselves on? Field's open. It's an open-ended question. What kinds of limits have God placed on us? He said, no, don't just do that at your free will. Limit it to this. Okay. Pick up a collection on the first day. We'll talk about that in a minute, though. I'm going to use that for another illustration. What about, has God made man to procreate? He made them male and female, and he told them what? Be fruitful and multiply. Do we multiply, add liberty, however we want to, as often as we want to, with as many people as we want to? No, what has he said? For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to a wife. And that relationship should be respected. And the marriage bed is undefiled. But fornication is a defilement of sexual relations. There are limits that he's placed on that behavior. There's limits that he places on how little we work. What's God's view on laziness and a refusal to work? If a man doesn't work, neither let him eat. There are limits to how much we should rest or refuse to work. You mentioned one. That's correct. We are emotional creatures. He gave us with feelings, but he tells us that we should not allow our feelings to drive us, but instead we should do what? Manage and control them. In the New Testament time frame, there were certain people who were given the power to prophesy and to speak in tongues and do various things like that, but he told them to do what? He said, I want you to manage those things and only use them to edify. And if it's not edifying, then it ought not be done. So there's limits that he placed on certain things. And then there are other circumstances where he has said, don't limit yourself too much. For instance, he says, lay by and store upon the first day of the week. He says, do it according to how you purpose in your heart. But then he turns around and says what? Not grudgingly, but cheerfully and generously. And then he gives us these great examples of people who do it sacrificially, who go beyond what their reasonable responsibility is because they want to share with others. And then he tells us things like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which says of my behavior, don't limit myself to the minimum that I can do for someone else, but instead be generous toward them. Treat them in a fashion that you would hope that someone would treat you? Do we want people to be generous to us, or do we want people to be cruel? And so there's other things that we tend to not want to do, in other words. And so we set limits for ourselves, and God says, yeah, don't limit yourself so much in that respect. Be generous and give and ask for nothing in return. How many people just naturally say, you know what, I'm going to be generous and give and ask for nothing in return? Or are we more likely to go to someone and say, hey, you remember when I did this favor for you back 20 years ago? Well, that is time for you to return the favor. I need something from you now. And he says, no, you know what? Don't think that way. Be more generous than that. Help people without any expectation of ever receiving any help. And so there's these other times that we're supposed to go another mile, is the way Jesus would put it. If you're pressed into service for a mile, he said what? Go with him 2. If they ask for your coat, give them your shirt also. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn and offer the other cheek. What is all that about? Well, that's just simply about going the extra mile. That's about taking up 2 days' collection instead of 1. And so all of these things are being set forth here. This is a test of their character, a test of what's important to them, a test if they're listening to God and letting that inform them, or if they're making decisions for themselves and trying to conform their idea of God to what they want. By the way, what have they been doing here? God, please deliver us. We don't like the way you delivered us. They're doing the opposite of that. They're constraining their view of God to their own will rather than shaping their will by God. And so that's part of what's going on here. He hears your grumblings, verse 7. He hears your grumblings, verse 8. There's something else to be aware of. Don't think that you're grumbling in secret. Yes, we all do it. We don't like something that someone says or does, and we grumble under our breath. And then as soon as we think they're out of earshot, we turn to the person next to us and say, oh, that just irritates me so bad. I don't know why he always does that. And then what happens if we say that sometime, and lo and behold, we find out they actually aren't out of earshot and they did hear us saying those things? Oh, we're quite embarrassed. Well, listen, anytime you grumble about God, the Lord hears you. Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord. Moses said to Aaron, verse 9, say to the congregation of the sons of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumblings. It came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. I don't know exactly what that means, other than what it says. They became keenly aware of what? God's presence and his majesty and greatness. It's not just a cloud of smoke at this point. They see the glory of God. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the son of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. I'm going to stop there for a moment. I don't know. I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't know a whole lot about that part of the world and its geography, but I'm thinking it's an odd thing to have dew set in the middle of the wilderness of Sinai. I think that the point here is that it was obvious that this was something that was being done. It wasn't just a normal everyday occurrence. And then when the dew, it tells you that it's not South Louisiana because the dew around here doesn't evaporate until like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's just steam at that point. When it evaporates, he says, there's going to be this flake-like substance. Now, in another place, it's defined as being like bdellium, which is a gum, a tar type stuff. And so this is hard to describe, I think is the way I would put it. It's some kind of flake-like thin layer of gummy substance. One place it's described as being like bread baked with oil. And then here in a moment, we're going to see it's like bread baked with honey. In this context, I think it tasted like some kind of bread when they turned it into bread. When the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. All right, there's a lot of folks out there that try to make this a naturalistic thing that happens. Listen, these people lived in this part of the world. They'd never seen anything like this before. This was not naturalistic. What is it? They did not know what it was, and Moses said to them, "It's the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather it, every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece according to the number of your persons of you each has in his tent." An omer, by the way, is about 2 liters, as I understand it. The sons of Israel did so, and some gathered much and some little. And when they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. And Moses said to them, "Let no man leave any of it until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left a part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul, and Moses was angry with them. Now, here's a neat thing, too, I'm going to throw in here. Why was Moses angry with them? Because they weren't following, in his mind, his instructions. The fact of the matter is, Moses wasn't the one that should have been angry with them. Who should have been angry with them? God. It wasn't Moses that was being rejected, it was God. Possibly, but that actually is a lesson in and of itself. I brought up Jonah earlier for a reason, because his lesson was, why are you angry about this plant that you didn't have anything to do with? When it's God's end of the stick, let God worry about it. Don't get angry at someone because they're not obeying God. Let God get angry at them for that. Instead, what should we do? Encourage, teach, try to stimulate, try to influence. Pity. Pity seems to be a much more reasonable response to someone whom you know is putting themselves in jeopardy than anger. And yet anger, this indignation, is what we almost always feel. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Another emotion driving that, whether it be a family member or a close friend or somebody you know who knew the truth, is now putting themselves in a situation where now they're on the road to go. And 9 times out of 10, in my experience, most of the people that I know in my personal life, it's more so a sense of sadness that drives that sense of anger. because they won't listen.
Well, I think sadness is a perfectly legitimate feeling. But I think the indignation should be limited to just the wastefulness of it all. Because the fact of the matter is, we have the capacity to do what is right. And in honesty, the anger really should be directed back at me as I look at myself and I realize I'm really seeing my own shortcomings in others. That's really what it comes down to. So anyway, they gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat. But when the sun grew hot, it would melt. It came about on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregations came and told Moses, then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath. That just means rest. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning. So they put aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. I like this because if you take the position that it was just a naturalistic situation, that whatever this substance was, it spoiled very quickly, so it becoming foul by morning was just a natural occurrence, then this is a miracle. If you take the position that this is a natural occurrence, then the other 6 days are miraculous. The spoilage quickly. Doesn't really matter how you want to argue this. Fact of the matter is, the limits placed on it were the limits that were placed on it by God. He made it spoil, and when it needed to last longer, he made it last longer. Moses said, eat today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find any in the field. Don't bother go out looking for it. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. And it came about on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? Now, maybe that had something to do with why Moses got angry, by the way, because he knew that he was the one that was going to get in trouble. That's kind of why your boss gets angry at you. Your boss gets angry at you not necessarily because he doesn't like you, but your boss gets angry at you because he knows that his boss is going to yell at him.
You directed it, or specifically, or you generic?
That's a good question. And we take those things very often personal, when maybe they're not as personal. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you bread for 2 days. On the 6th day, remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. And the house of Israel named it manna. And it was like coriander seed. It gets that description in Numbers as well, like coriander seed. Yes, ma'am.
It says that manna literally means what?
It is a you know, what he's saying is they where this started, they didn't know what it was. That's what they called it, whatever this stuff is. It was white. Its taste was like wafers with honey. Like I mentioned in Numbers, its taste is like a loaf baked with oil. Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omerful be kept throughout your generations, that they may see the bread that I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm going to stop there for a minute. This has reference to the omer that was kept in the Ark of the Covenant. Here's something for you. Manna normally spoiled overnight. On the 6th day, it lasted 48 hours. This omer stayed in the ark and never spoiled. That's the power of God. Moses said to Aaron, take a jar, put an omer full of manna in it, place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. And the sons of Israel ate the manna 40 years. Now, this is where we're finding out. This is looking forward. See, the ark hasn't even been made yet. So this is looking forward to what he would have them to do. They ate it for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now, an omer is a tenth of an ephah. Now, an ephah is, I'm told, 22 liters. That's where I came up with a little over 2 liters is an omer, because it's a tenth of 22 liters. I think an ephah is about 3/5 of what we would call a bushel. But because nobody farms anymore, we don't really know what a bushel looks like. So I came up with the metric measurement of 2 liters. We do know what a 2-liter soda looks like. So anyway, that's kind of that. Now let's talk about some of this in the little bit of time we have left. The connections to earlier chapters, complaints and provisions of God, we've already talked about that to some extent. This is very similar to their complaint in chapter 15 about lacking water. Now it's just about food. We see God's faithfulness. The provision of manna and the quail shows God continued faithfulness, continued to care for these people. By the way, there are whiners and grumblers and complainers over and over and over again, but you know what God keeps doing? He keeps providing. But you know what he's providing? He's providing their needs. He's not withholding their needs. Doesn't necessarily mean that he's making life easy for them. And he's not requiring them to do anything. They've got to go out and work and gather. So he's not necessarily doing it for them, but he is making it possible for them to have everything that they need. That is an important lesson for us as well. What we need, God provides. That does not mean that we don't have to work for it. That does not mean that there aren't limitations associated with it, that there aren't right ways and wrong ways to do it. It's great for us to work and earn a portion of this world's goods. It's not great when we work and earn a portion of this world's goods by doing something evil or by being dishonest or lying to people or any other kinds of things that go on in this world to gain more. We have limitations and restrict. We're supposed to do these things and we're supposed to be content. All right. Connections to New Testament texts. Look at John 6:31 with me real quick. John chapter 6, verses 31 through 35. Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread out of heaven to eat. Jesus therefore said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it is not Moses who's given you the bread out of heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. They said therefore to him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But he said, but I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. What's Jesus doing there? He's drawing a connection between God's provision of the manna and himself coming into the world. In other words, what he's telling us here is that the manna was really a shadow of substance, which was him. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. What does John 1 say about Jesus? The word became flesh and dwelt among us. You read about the manna in Exodus, you're reading about the Christ. Matthew 6:11. Lord's Prayer is what it's often called. There's a line in that says, give us this day our daily bread. Daily dependence upon God. Reinforced in this. You do this every day. Take the day's bread. Be satisfied with that. Trust that God will give you food again tomorrow. You know, that first day, I can imagine people going, you know what? It may not be here tomorrow. Let's take some extra. Yes, ma'am.
Almost assassinated. It was 6:11 p.m. and they referenced Ephesians 6:11. And I like how you just said Matthew 6:11. And Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. I just thought that was cool.
There's a lot of those weird little coincidences that pop up. The Sabbath rest, the instruction to gather twice as much on the sixth day to observe the Sabbath rest. Let's look at Hebrews 4 real quick. I know I'm out of time, but I want to get this done. Hebrews 4. Verses 9 and 10 we will limit ourselves to, though we could read more. He talks about the rest and all this kind of stuff, and then he says, if Joshua, this is the ultimate rest going into the promised land. If Joshua had given them rest, it says in verse 8, he would not have spoken of another day after that. Therefore there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered into his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. That's the Genesis reference to this idea of a Sabbath. In other words, there's a Sabbath rest coming, but it's at the end. We're in the 6 days. It's not time for us to rest. The Sabbath rest remains for us, and it comes later. All right, I got to stop. Appreciate y'all's presence and participation tonight. And I closed my Bible. Anybody, I finished chapter 16, right? I did not get into chapter 17. So we'll pick up in chapter 17, Lord willing, next time.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story.